In my last video, I had said that being unpredictable is impossible because of the fact that we as humans are predictable. But is this truly the case? The short answer is yes, but there's more to it. While it is technically impossible to be completely random, there are things that may make things seem more random than they actually are. Being able to recognize these things quickly in a match can be the difference between winning consistently and dropping a set to someone who seems to think that DK up B is the best anti-air in the game. If we can't be unpredictable, then why is it that many players look unpredictable? Well, the answer to that is quite obvious. We don't see the thought process that goes on in someone's head. It's not like an interface where we press a button and voila, we now know exactly why Leo did bear. This also doesn't take into account the fact that what might seem to be an unpredictable mix-up was actually an intelligent read. We don't know why people that are better than us do what they do, so we just call it a mix-up and be done with it. This means that, yes, top players are quite literally too big-brained for us to understand. So instead of trying to think of it as these players being random, try to think of them as being ambiguous. Because the most important thing to identify here is the difference between randomness and ambiguity in play. Randomness is exactly what it sounds like, being completely random with your movement and options. Of course, when someone says to be unpredictable, they don't mean this complete randomness. Rather, simply using different options that your opponent might not expect. Ambiguity, however, is using the fact that not only does your opponent need to do something, but cannot reliably react to what you do. On top of this, an ambiguous player also recognizes that their opponent isn't completely stupid and will probably try to counter what's hitting them. Using this, an ambiguous player would pick an option that may seem random, but in reality is based on what that ambiguous player's opponent has done in that same situation under the same influence. What is the difference between randomness and ambiguity then? The difference here is consistency and reliability. Randomness is just doing random options that aren't even inherently random. Even if you choose different options, that's not being random, that's just forcing your opponent to not be completely brain dead. Randomness is, in essence, a gimmick, something that throws your opponent off once or twice, and then something to never be used again. Ambiguity, on the other hand, is using what your opponent has to do. As in, your opponent needs to actually guess in order to get out of a bad situation against an ambiguous opponent, on top of that guess being very difficult to make because of the influence put onto that opponent. This guessing is normally based on the ambiguous player's previous actions, which that player could use to their advantage. Because of this, ambiguity is significantly more consistent and is able to be used against a higher range of opponents. So then how can one be ambiguous rather than random? Well, everything one does has an influence on their opponent. At times, this influence is the only thing the opponent will have as a signal of what to do. This means that being ambiguous is technically as simple as recognizing the influence you have on your opponent to think one way, and then using another unreactable option that wins against how your opponent might act in response. It's more complicated than that, but this is the essence. In order to expand on this essence, think about how your opponent acts whenever they get hit with something. They generally tend to avoid it. When you tell them to do something, their stupid monkey brain will oblige more often than not because they don't want to get hit. This is something you can very easily abuse if you're looking for it. Isn't this just conditioning though? Well, I guess you could call it conditioning, but saying they're the same thing would be like calling soft tacos burritos. You see, conditioning is when you're trying to make your opponent do or think certain things throughout the course of a match. This means that what you're doing is acting with the specific intention of influencing your opponent in a particular way. Ambiguity, however, is a bit accidental. Here's the thing about being ambiguous. You can't always be intentional with your influence. There are always times where you simply cannot get your opponent to act in the exact way you want them to. In that case, it's more about seeing how you influence your opponent without actively trying to do it. Your actions have influence, but that influence may go entirely unnoticed if you aren't actively trying to use it. Ambiguity is the ability to use that influence regardless of intentionality. So the fundamental difference between conditioning and ambiguity is which part of the neutral cycle you're trying to emphasize, the cause or the effect. Because of all of this, Being unpredictable is actually a combination of the influence you have on your opponent and the recognition of that influence. Both of these processes can be conscious, however, someone will normally only be able to do one at a time. This allows you to much more easily see both in what ways your opponent is influencing you and in what ways your opponent is taking advantage of that influence. This does assume you know how your opponent is thinking about an option, which isn't reliable, but if you can find a pattern of how they act before and after an option, it becomes a little easier. This adds a lot of specific mind games that likely aren't worth actually exploring, at least not until you really need to. The basic gist you should know is the 50-50 between conditioning and ambiguity. If someone is trying to condition you, simply don't fall for it or use an option that covers both the option in which the opponent is conditioning with and multiple options in which the opponent can take advantage of that conditioning. If someone is trying to be ambiguous, you'll either want to attempt to condition them yourself or guess in what way they will use their influence based on how they used it before. This 50-50 depends entirely on one thing though. You see, while both players have influence on each other, one player will often be the one actively trying to use it, while the other will be pushing away from the other's influence. One that recognizes that their opponent is trying to influence them and is able to figure out in what ways the opponent is using that influence will force the person using the influence to switch gears and do something else entirely based on how you respond. This opens them up to being influenced and then forcing them to recognize your influence, and then the cycle repeats. Don't even bother trying to do all this Yomi consistently though. Just understand that the influence two players have on each other is a constant game of tug of war where one is trying to strong arm the other into specific options, and that sometimes the best way to deal with conditioning is to not even bother with the mix-up and just catch your opponent in their massive brain setup by doing something so incredibly stupid that they couldn't possibly come up with a solution. All that silly mind game stuff should be put into your head, but it's not important enough to really base your game plan on. Sometimes you can even call this tug of war a pool of mix-ups your opponent uses and move on from there until there's evidence that this is what they're trying to do in the first place. Because, to be honest, thinking about all this for what is potentially something with a much simpler solution is wildly inefficient. While your opponent might be thinking about this too, and all of this is the reason why people seem unpredictable, if you aren't forced to think too hard, don't do it. A lot of this can be placed into your back pocket, and this sort of unpredictability is unintentional more often than not. The simple fact of the matter is, not a whole lot of people are trying to be seemingly unpredictable on purpose. Many are just running their game plan with a few filters based on how you act. As a result, using a less taxing concept to put your opponent in a broader box is not only significantly more efficient, but more effective against some players. I think it's time for me to stop talking and actually let you internalize this concept a little bit. Unpredictability, while technically impossible, will always be something that our minds will have to deal with. TLDR, this game is really hard. Be ambiguous, stop rolling dice, but don't be fooled by impossibility. This has been Mixups 2 Electric Boogaloo by Small Child Lord. Please subscribe for more Smash related content.